Hello, my friends. Welcome to my presentation. This is going to be on the design and conduct of clinical trials, and this is just the top level introduction, just to give myself a break from my case study of clinical trials. So we're not going to be doing too much of a deep dive, um, but there are just a few things that I wanted to do and just make it nice and easy for me and something simple for me to do. So this is my contents. Um, so I'm just going to give you a quick recap on these CAR T cell therapies, not necessarily because of the fact that we'll be talking about these CAR T cell therapies, but because of the fact that I will be discussing them in something or another, which I can't recall. And then I want to talk about the sponsor's consideration um, a, for planning a clinical trial. I want to talk about the trial design, good clinical practice, conducting a clinical trial, and I just want to touch upon the clinical trial regulation, but I'm not going to do a deep dive in this presentation. So this is the first part, the recap of my theoretical CAR T cell therapies. So my very first CAR T cell therapy, which is a theoretical product, is LAT101. That's the code, the product code that we use for it. And this is an autologous CAR T cell therapy generated by ex vivo transduction. And it's designed as an all-gate tandem CAR targeting CD19 and CD22. It also has a co-stimulatory domain, CD28, and an inducible caspase-9 safety switch. It's bispecific, is a bispecific CAR designed to activate T cells upon recognition of either antigen, either CD19 or CD22, and thereby reducing the risk of antigen escape. So it's intended for the treatment of relapse or refractory B-cell malignancies, and they include diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So this product is a treatment agnostic, and it can be used for more than one cohort. The second product, theoretical product, is LAT202, and it's an allogeneic CAR T cell CRISPR-Cas9 engineered CAR, and it is an AND gate bispecific targeting mechanism, and it's targeted against this aberrant glycosylated MUC1 and HER2. So MUC1 is a polymorphic epithelial mucin, and HER2 is the human epidermal growth factor receptor. Receptor 2. So the product comprises of two distinct CARs, each with its own co-stimulatory domain. So CD28 for MUC1 targeting CAR and 41BB for the HER2 targeting CAR. LAT202 is further CRISPR-Cas9 engineered to resist TGF-beta mediated immunosuppression. So it's armored, it's an armored T cell. And its additional engineering features include an inducible caspase-9 safety switch, which I think should be the standard for these types of products, just from a safety perspective, and the expression of chemokine receptor CXCR2 to enhance tumor-directed trafficking. So LAT202 is intended for the treatment of advanced or metastatic solid tumors expressing HER2 and aberrantly glycosylated MUC1, such as pancreatic, lung, and breast cancer. And the AND gate ensures that T cell activation only occurs upon simultaneous recognition of both tumor-associated antigens, thereby improving tumor specificity and minimizing of tumor toxicity. Yeah. Right, I just want to talk about what happens, or what I think should happen, and what I've found from my research. So this is the feasibility studies and gap analysis and due diligence that should occur when we're developing these types of products. Remember that I am using this fictitious company, and what should be happening in the background, as well as the development program that we've previously discussed. So this is kind of like a very top level overview of what happens. You have your product development, and then you have your non-clinical studies, and you will have your pivotal non-clinical or definitive non-clinical studies before your clinical development. Now, you will do some non-clinical studies prior to your pivotal or your definitive non-clinical studies, just to, like pilot studies, to determine what are the best animal models and what are the best disease models to use. But this is just an overall view, and your non-clinical development is ordered to provide the rationale, the safety rationale, the scientific rationale for going into patients. So you have your clinical development and then your marketing authorization and approval. So that's kind of like a very top level overview of what happens. And then what needs to happen in terms of the development program for LAF Therapeutics Limited? Well, you do need to have feasibility studies. You need to be able to, determine whether or not this product is something that we should realistically progress. You know, will it go into patients? Will the amount of money that you spend on your not definitive non-clinical studies, you do need to have some understanding. Is it going to actually be a successful or viable product? And that would be what your feasibility studies would be as well. And the other thing, looking long term, is this a marketable product? Is it likely to obtain approval, not just a marketing authorization approval, but approval by the relevant health technology assessment bodies to actually make this product available to patients via their health service in the member states? So those are the things that you have to think about, and you have to consider, not just looking at the product development, but looking at, is it feasible? Is this actual clinical trial? Because the clinical trial, the non-clinical data has to mirror to a large extent your clinical trial, and you have to have some understanding whether or not your clinical trial is even feasible, and if it is, before you go and spend a lot of time and resource on clinical studies, on your non-clinical development studies, or even your clinical studies. So what are the preparation in terms of your feasibility? Well, you start with your key opinion leaders. So in the example given for LAT 101 and LAT 202, well, for LAT 101, this would be opinion leaders. These may be physicians, experts who have expertise in hematological malignancies or diffuse large B cell lymphomas, or acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So you want to have key opinion leaders that will actually provide you with the information that you need to, number one, determine whether there is an unmet need. You want to get that input, whether or not this product is actually feasible, what the patient population is, if there are any special considerations for that patient population, say for example if they're a pediatric patient, and the logistics, whether or not this can actually occur, whether or not the site has the ability to conduct these, to deliver what the protocol requires. So the site feasibility, and whether or not there are the endpoints that you consider are realistic, and what the potential safety concerns are likely to be. We can get this information from literature search, published scientific journals, but those published scientific journals are usually from the key opinion leaders. And the other thing is the health technology assessment. So, as I say, you want to think long term. And long term, you want to make sure that you provide the evidence, the clinical evidence that's required for other bodies. So these health technology assessment bodies, they're responsible for performing the clinical assessment and the non-clinical assessment to determine whether or not these medicines should, their particular either insurance or bodies or hospitals and national health services, say for example, should spend the money on these drugs. What is the cost benefit approach? And so um, a regulation in the EU provides this harmonized approach with regards to clinical evidence generation, but you want to obtain that buy-in as soon as possible so you can make use of this joint scientific consultation. And this is to advise developers on the evidence generation that's required before your trial begins, so that you can ensure that you provide the relevant data that can make these products available post after you've got your approval. Another group that we really should obtain input and advice from are patient groups. Patient groups, they help us to understand, what outcomes matter to the patient, what burdens the patients can tolerate, what risks they understand, and what information needs to be in your in consent forms. And they can also contribute to the trial design and advise as to what features are acceptable to them and not acceptable. Patients groups can also provide input with regards to ethics committees and ethical considerations. So you need to get that input and that those communications going and introduce that input into your trial, because without the patients and without your subjects and participants, you don't have a clinical trial, you don't have a product. Patients groups can also advise you with regards to your documentation. They can help you to shape, what information and the layout with regards to your recruitment materials. They can give you information or help you to shape your patient-facing materials, as well as your lay summary documents that have to be produced following the clinical trial. So it's a really important resource to take advantage of and to utilize. And now, particularly for ATMPs, this is standard practice to get input from your patient groups. So what do patients want? Well, the three things in blue is life extension, the quality of life improvement, and they want that potential curative or life-saving outcomes. So your life extension, what is that? They want to have more life, meaningful life, more time with their family, more time without disease progression, more time to live. And how do we measure those? That's in the gold part of these blocks. So, for example, the overall survival, the progression-free survival, event-free survival, and duration of response. So these are how we measure in our protocol the desires that the patient wants. Quality of life, they want to be able to live with fewer side effects. They want less hospitalization, less pain, more independence, the ability to work, the ability to be a parent, to travel, and simply to enjoy daily life. And how do we measure this? We look at the quality of life instruments, we look at symptom burdens, and we have patient-reported outcomes, for monitoring these outputs. And then the other thing that they really want is potential cure, life-saving outcomes. So they want that deep remission, durable remission. They want to have that long-term survival and really the possibility of a cure. And so how we measure this is we're looking at the minimal residual disease and having that negative result, looking at long-term survival curves and treatment-free remission. So this is what we do. We get the needs and the wants and the desires from the patient, and we find a way of qualifying and quantifying that so that we can have a clinical trial that reflects the patient's requirements, but in a quantifiable way. So let's talk about the trial design, because how you design your trial depends upon various inputs, and those inputs come from different places. So in your clinical trial, you start with a question. You have a question that you're trying to answer. What are we trying to prove? And you start with your null hypothesis, and that means that there's an assumption that there's no difference between your investigational medicinal product and the comparator. So you always have to have a comparator when you're doing a clinical trial, to be able to make an outcome, to be able to say, to make a, what's the word I mean? Oh, I can't think of a word, but you need to be able um, to to say that this product has is better than or not, and you need a comparator to do that. So you will be looking at superiority, you'll be looking at non-inferiority or equivalence. There are plenty of courses that go through this, Coursera courses that you can use and follow for this. But you really want to compare your treatment against the standard of care. What is the standard of care, or what is the best available therapy? And you will be looking at certain endpoints, in the case of specific diseases that are serious diseases. You'll be looking at survival, you'll be looking at response, you'll be looking at quality of life feedback and endpoints, and you'll be looking at biomarkers. And in addition to that, you have to think about, when you're designing your clinical trial, your patient population. What's going to be your inclusion and exclusion criteria, your eligibility criteria? The disease stage affects the outcomes and your results as well, and if they have had any prior therapy. So this is the scientific foundation, if you like, and it's something that is required for both a regulatory perspective and your health technology assessments. So the JCA, they use the same logic, but at an EU level. So in the EU, it doesn't have to be EU, it can be national, any, but you really want to get that scientific advice. So scientific advice can include protocol advice with regards to how you conduct your clinical trial. For example, they might review and propose your endpoints, your comparators, your population, and your safety monitoring. They can advise you on whether the design will actually support your marketing authorization, which is what you want long term. So it makes sense to get that advice. Particularly for small companies that spend a lot of resource on this. Your pediatric plans, pediatric investigation plans, your safety expectations. So, for example, your data safety monitoring board, your dose escalation committees, etc. Your stopping rules, what your risk mitigation plans are and what they should be. And also they will provide scientific advice with regards to the quality, and that's about the actual investigational medicinal product. So your investigational medicinal product dossier will be reviewed to ensure manufacturing consistency and stability as required for the trial. The other thing that's important is your GMO regulatory requirements, particularly for ATMPs. Now, this is the rate limiting step or that causes the most delays. So that early engagement with the regulators that you plan to submit in is important, because the GMO requirement is different for each member state. And you want to ensure that you have time to gather the data. You also want to make sure that the health authorities have time to actually review your data so that you can get that green light in order to conduct that clinical trial. So your health technology assessment bodies, they're responsible for deciding if these products should be funded, if you like, by member state countries, national bodies, such as in the UK it'd be like National Health Services or health authorities. And this is about having access so that doctors and physicians and medics can prescribe these drugs to patients. In order for them to make those decisions, they need evidence. And so you need to have input into your clinical trial design, the relevant I don't know, the relevant attributes or objectives to gather that evidence specifically for clinical effectiveness. And you need to have information on the comparators justification and real world relevant endpoints. So this information is what goes into your trial design. As I said, remember, you want to ensure that you get this information, you design it into your trial so that you're not looking back at or post after the trial retrospectively trying to gather and interpret data. You build that data or you build that requirement into your trial. And the joint clinical assessment teams or committees, they will do the assessment on an EU level, but they will only look at the clinical benefit versus the existing benefits. And that's to have that harmonized approach that I talked about earlier. And it's to ensure that the trial, as I say, gathers the evidence that is acceptable across multiple member states. So the quality adjusted life years and the cost effectiveness modelling and long-term outcomes, all of these are national HTA expectations, so they still have remit over the non-clinical aspects. And as we said, the patient relevant outcomes are important and have to be taken into consideration, and that really is life extension. That really is having a good quality of life where there is less hospitalization, less treatment, and potentially curative benefits. So, as I said, the Health Technology Assessment Regulation, which came into force, I think it came into force in January 2025, and it's looking at really the EU level, so the clinical domain. So whenever you have your health technology assessments, there's two domains. There's your clinical domain, which is at the EU level, and then there's your non-clinical domain, which is at the member state level. And your clinical domain, you'll be looking at your description of health problems, description of technology, relevant clinical effectiveness, and relative safety. Whereas your non-clinical domain, you're really looking at the economic evaluations. You will be looking at organizational aspects, social aspects, legal aspects, and ethical aspects. But so even though some of the requirements, the clinical requirements, is done at an EU level, some of the non-clinical requirements are done at a member state level. So you have to take that into consideration. These are important. Your risk benefit assessment, your trial has to demonstrate that the anticipated benefits justify the risks to the participants. And that's an important part of your part one and maybe even part two assessment, but mainly part one assessment. You want to make sure that you have documented, usually in your protocol, but also maybe in other documents, the risk benefit assessment. And you need to be able to demonstrate that the anticipated benefits justify the risks. Informed consent is very important. They must have clear, understandable information about the study and its risks, and where necessary, you may have to adapt the information to suit the ability of the person giving the consent. Say, for example, in the case of young children, even though, say, for example, their parent may be giving us consent, you may still be required to explain to the child what they are going to have to go through. So informed consent process is really important, and from an ethical perspective, you have to take into consideration vulnerable populations and mitigate for exploitation. Oh, well, we got that there. So vulnerable populations, extra protection are required when enrolling people with limited autonomy. So people who maybe have mental health issues, people with, for example, prisoners, etc. So that's really important. And then you have to think about the burden of the procedures, and you have to design your trial to minimize unnecessary discomfort, unnecessary inconvenience or risk. And the other thing is you have to consider how your participants can access investigational medicinal product after the study ends, if it's relevant and if it's safe to do so. Right, now, basically this is just an overall summary slide, and it's just basically talking about the input that you need when you're designing your trial, or that you should really consider. It's not mandatory, but extremely helpful, and that is that you have to have ideally have scientific advice, so European Medicines Agency or national scientific advice with regards to your documentation, your protocol, your investigational medicinal product dossier, etc. You want to have that HTA early engagement to ensure that you generate the data during your trial so that it is specific, and so that you can you don't have to retrospectively interpret data. You also want to take advantage of the joint consultation assessment procedures that will enable that clinical assessment to be done at the member state, sorry, at the EU level access or level assessments. Funding is important. Manufacturing readiness is also important. You want to have a well-characterized manufacturing process. You don't have to, for clinical trials, you don't have to have a validated clinical manufacturing method process, apart from if it's aseptic. So you have to validate the viral and safety and adventitious agent safety, but you don't have to validate the actual manufacturing method itself, but you do have to have well qualified, well characterized manufacturing method and optimized manufacturing method, and continuous improvement plans. And you also have to think about your logistics planning. You have to think about whether or not the sites do have the equipment and the training and the staff and access to the patient population in order to conduct these trials. I just want to give a very, very top level overview on good clinical practice. So there's certain things that need to be in place before you can conduct a clinical trial. So we talked about what needs to be designed into the trial, but once you've actually decided that you want to go ahead and conduct a clinical trial, these are the things that you need to have in place, and that is a signed clinical trial agreement. And this is a full executed clinical trial agreement, a contract that details the financial terms, responsibilities, and indemnity clauses. So that's, before a site can enroll participants, that has to be in place. Insurance and indemnity is important. So investigator indemnity, subject insurance, injury insurance, and product liability cover is especially important. This is a legal requirement under clinical trial regulation and national laws. So these have to be in place. Any drug really should be released by a qualified person, to be honest with you. But the investigational medicinal product definitely does have to be released by a qualified person, and that qualified person must be named in the manufacturing authorization for the investigational medicinal product. Each batch has to be QP certified, and GMP compliance must be confirmed. And the importation license is required if the investigational medicinal product is manufactured outside the EU or European Economic Area. So without your QP release, you have no investigational medicinal product, and you can't start the trial, or even you can't release the product for the patient, say for example during a trial, if the QP hasn't actually released the the product, then you can't really give the product, administer the product to the patient. Yeah, sites must have the relevant standard operating procedures, not just for handling the IMP, but for other things. Storage conditions have to be validated, particularly if you're dealing with products that are sensitive to storage, say, for example, temperature sensitive. Temperature monitoring has to be in place so that you can check, go back and review and audit what has happened and when. Chain of custody processes are incredibly important, particularly for autologous products or patient-specific medicines, and destruction procedures have to be in place before you even conduct your trial, and this has to be regularly reviewed during your site inspections, and all of this is part of your site activation. So all of these processes must be in place before you can start to conduct your clinical trial. You have to have a delegation log, so the principal investigator has to sign off who's doing what, who's been delegated to do what. There needs to be, their training records have to be in place for that delegation, and they need to be able to demonstrate that they understand the principles of good clinical practice, and this is required before your first participant is required. This is part of your essential documents that should be held on the site, and as well as some of them will be held on the sponsor site as well. So your essential documents in the investigator site file. So these will be your protocol, so your most up-to-date versioned protocol, the investigator's brochure, again, the most up-to-date, approval documents, insurance documents, lab certifications, CVs, training logs and delegation logs, and site investigator visit reports. All of these have to be, these are all essential documents, and they have to be available for inspection before recruitment and are maintained during the conduct of clinical trials. Yeah, the investigator site file is just that part of the trial master file. So it's going to meet the same requirements of good clinical practice, i.e. to allow the reconstruction of the trial, has to be inspection ready, and it has to be archived after the trial. So I just want to talk about conducting clinical trials. Before you can even start a clinical trial, you need to have three things in place. You need to have that clinical trial authorization. Remember, this is in the European Union, European Economic Area. You need to have that clinical trial authorization. So you need to have authorization by the scientific review of the product itself, the investigational medicinal product, the intervention. And you also need to have that ethical review from the relevant ethical body by the member state. So you have to have that. You have to also, for certain ATMPs, you have to have GMO, genetically modified organisms approval. Now, this can be one of two things. It can be contained use or it can be deliberate release. This has to be submitted separately to each member state, and this can be the problem or the rate limiting step. So it's important to have that early engagement with the member states to advise them of the fact that you're planning this clinical trial and that you need to have this GMO available and approved, and you need to that needs to be done before the trial can be given the green light to go ahead. And the timeframes and the process and procedures for these are member state specific, I believe. And so therefore, as I say, that's the reason for the what's the word I'm looking for? The delays, the potential delays. Or at least it's not regimented, it's not defined, it's dependent upon each member state. And the last thing you need to have is that site activation. So as I said, certain things need to be in place, and good clinical practice, contracts need to be in place, good manufacturing practice, and just basically inspection ready. So that site activation, that's something that's under the control of the sponsor. But all of these things are required before you can actually have the green light to go ahead with the clinical trial. So let's just do a quick overview on the clinical trial regulation, because it's quite a big subject area. I can't give an in-depth overview, but just an overview. So what do you need to have in order to submit a clinical trial application via the CTIS, the Clinical Trial Information System? So first thing you need is you need to have an EMA account. In order to access CTIS, you have to have a European Medicines Agency account. Yeah. The other thing you need to have is OMS registration. So I've talked about this before. This is Organisation Management Service. So you have to be registered in the European Medicines Agency's database, OMS database, before, and it has to be retrieved, and you have to retrieve your details in the CTIS. So it's important to have that registration in your OMS registration. The other thing is you need to have a CTIS account, and you have that user management set up accordingly. And the other thing is also, for your CTIS account, you need to have the administrator role assigned as well, because the administrator is responsible for managing the clinical trial submission process. So you do need to have that all set up. Another point is that the sponsor has to be established within the European Union or the European Economic Area. And if they're not established within that area, they need to have a legal representative. And this is a requirement. So it's you do need to have that available. And the other thing is this registration in EudraVigilance. So this is required for SUSAR's reporting, or actually adverse reactions and serious adverse reaction reporting. So SUSAR's is suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reactions. Yeah. And what they are is that it's not consistent with the safety profile. It's not listed in the investigator's brochure or the SMPC, yeah, and it's serious in the sense that it's life-threatening, or a death has occurred, or hospitalization, or some kind of congenital anomaly. Basically, it's serious. It's a serious adverse reaction. But in order to be able to register them, report them into that EudraVigilance database, you need to have access to it. You need to have that access to it. And in order to have that access, you need to also have access to MedRA. MedRA is the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. And the reason is that, and even for that, you have to have OMS registration. Basically, SUSARs must be coded using the MedRA terminology before you can even submit it to the EudraVigilance database. So MedRA registration is required. And then the last thing is the registration of your investigational medicinal product in the XEVMP. So the medicinal product must be registered in the it's called the Extended EudraVigilance Medicinal Product Dictionary. Yeah. So before you can even file your clinical trial in any sections of the CTIS, you need to ensure that your medicinal product used in the trial is available in that Extended EudraVigilance Medicinal Product Dictionary. And this is what's in line with, I think it said Article 57, but I'm not 100% certain about that. But it includes all EU authorized medicinal products, as well as unauthorized development medicinal products. So therefore, those are the things that you need in place before you can even submit your clinical trial. You need to have an EMA account, you need to have a CTIS account and a CTIS administrator. You need to be established within the European Union or the European Economic Area, or if not, have a legal representative based in that area. You need to be have OMS registration of your company and your the personnel. you need to have that EudraVigilance database registration, and you also need to have the MEDRA registration, and you also have to have this XEVMPD registration, and this is before you begin your clinical trial. So here is the time frame for the Part 1 assessment. So the initial application consists of two parts, if you like, the Part 1 assessment and your Part 2. Yeah, so your day 0 start, and the day 6 is the confirmation with regards to your reporting member state. So the sponsor chooses a reporting member state, and if everyone agrees, including the reporting member state, that's confirmed by day 6. Day 7 is when you have your validation confirmation. So your validation is within day 10 is your validation confirmation. If you have any validation queries, or if the reporting member state has any validation queries, then the what am I thinking? Then they've got go back to the applicant, and the applicant has 10 days to confirm whether or not they've got the data. Now, within those 10 days, that validation period, there are the reporting member state has to confirm whether the clinical trial falls within the scope of the regulation, the clinical trial regulation, and whether or not the application dossier is complete in accordance with Annex 1. So there are two aspects, it's whether or not the clinical trial falls within the scope of the regulation. So that's one of the things. And the second aspect is whether or not the application dossier is complete. And then following on from that, there are 26 days for the assessment, Part 1 assessment. Now, for advanced therapy medicinal products and other specified medicinal products, you have 50 days additional, and that's automatic, yeah? And again, within that 26-day assessment period, Part 1 assessment period, including the 50 days automatically added on for the ATMP, you also have 31 days for the request for further information. And that 31 days includes 12 days for the sponsor to provide all the information, and then 19 days. And that 19 days consists of 12 days for coordinated review and 7 days for consolidation. Yeah, so that's regarding the additional information. And then once Part 1 assessment has been completed, then the member state reviews, and that's 12 days. And then you have the consolidation, and that's another 7 days. So, and then in total, without any, without your RFI, it takes 60 days, yeah, for the actual Part 1 assessment to be completed. With the addition of 50 days for your ATMPs, it's 110 days. And if you have the full 31 days for your RFI, then it's 31 added onto that. So it'd be 60 plus 31, 91 days if it was a normal assessment, and 31 plus 110 is 141 days for ATMP with your RFI. Here are some of the documentation that's required for your Part 1 assessment. So you have your protocol, your investigator's brochure, your investigational medicinal product dossier, the quality, safety, efficacy part, GMP documentation, so that's your manufacturing authorization, QP declaration, auxiliary medicinal products dossier, and your labeling documentation. So at the moment, the structured data is required to be entered into your clinical trial information system. Yeah. If if and when you do your submission. So this structured data is there for transparency. The structured data is used to communicate to the through the EU portal with regards to once the clinical trial has been approved, what information is available to the public. Yeah, so that's what the structured data is there. Now, structured data is a different kind of data to your normal data. Yeah, so structured data is defined. It's data that can be used in relational tables. It's data that can be read by machines and computers and technology. It's data that can be manipulated, not so much as in changed. The data isn't changed. It's just that the data can be consolidated. The data can be combined with other similar data and can be used to determine trends. Sorry about that. So first of all, what's the reason? So as I said, one of the reasons is you want to once the application has been approved, you want to have data available for the public. Yeah. Because you want to ensure that they have that information, that transparency. And these fields currently, as it stands in the clinical trial information system, they're set up in a way so that the EMA can automatically push the data to the public, yeah, and specifically in the EU clinical trials register website, yeah, and as I said, structured data can be consolidated into relational tables. So if you've learned, there's a language, a programming language called structured query language, and there is a concept of known as relational tables. So if you do a course on introduction to structured query language, you'll find out about that. And these relational tables contains the structured data. So structured data is different from data that you would have on a PDF, so a PDF data, you can't extract pieces of data from that PDF. But structured data, you input the information in, and it's stored as accurately, and it doesn't change unless you change it. Yeah, and you can then use that data in relational data tables, and you can query that data using structured query language. I didn't put that here, but I did do a course on this. So for example, I don't know whether we can do it, but I know that the European Medicines Agency is working on it, where they can do a query like to see all the phase 2 trials currently recruiting for something, in a say asthma in France, and they can do that without having to open all the PDFs for all the protocols. They can just get the data because it has been inputted and it doesn't change. So you can query the data, and it's useful. It's useful to see what the landscape is regarding all the different therapies. But in any case, with regards to CTIS, the structured data relates to the study design, the trial endpoints, these are the primary and secondary goals, and the population and the product. So the study design, whether it's randomized, double blind, I wouldn't say phase 3 is a study design. Sorry, that's a mistake there, but it should be randomized or double blinded. The trial endpoints, what the primary and the secondary endpoints and estimands are. The population, so the age ranges, the sex, and the medical condition, and the inclusion-exclusion criteria, the eligibility criteria, and the products itself. Yes, I am going to talk about the ICH M11 because the ICH M11 also has structured data. Yeah, so the title section contains structured data, and this is what happens is that when we use the ICH M11 protocol template, the it says C sharp. Well, I'll show it to you in a second. But when we read that template, or use that template, the ICH M11 electronic template, the protocols can be read by the CTIS, and it means that you don't have to manually be inputting the information into the structured part of the CTIS. It just automatically uploads. And this basically and also the purpose of the ICH M11 template is to ensure consistency and efficiency for faster review times, because of the fact that you're not searching for data and documents. It has got this structured format. So this is the ICH M11 protocol template, and it is the Clinical Electronic Structured Harmonized Protocol. That's what that CE sharp stands for. It stands for Clinical Electronic Structured Harmonized Protocol Template. And what they mean by structured is that this whole document is a mixture of structured and unstructured data. And structured data is data that can be transferred into relational tables, and they can be queried. So you can query it using languages such as SQL or SQL. I call it SQL. I don't know what it's called. Structured query language. And the thing is that you can then um, analyze data. So you can analyze data from multiple clinical trials that could be ongoing. So you could be looking at clinical trials, all the clinical trials that are ongoing in Europe that and worldwide, that involve the use of, say for example, that's looking at, say for example, certain hematological malignancies, yeah, and at what phase of development they're at. So if they're phase 1 and phase 2, and you can do that by looking at these structured data, and by collecting these structured data, because they are data that are defined, and collecting them, and then analyzing them. You can collect them in relational tables, and you can analyze those data, and you can do so in an efficient and effective and easy way, and it just makes it easier to understand the landscape for whatever products you're looking at, in terms of development, in terms of what's going on at this moment in time. And it's easy for the regulators to do, and it's also easy um, for industry to, well, eventually for industry to do. So structured data and the use of technology and digitalization is going to be an important part of regulatory affairs and clinical trials, as well as post-approval activities. So let's take a look at what part of the document is going to be structured. So the part is I don't want to go through this. It's not the purpose of this presentation, and this is a top line presentation. It's not an in-depth presentation, yeah? So this is the title section, yeah? So this is the title page, and the order of the title page elements should be preserved, and that's because of the fact that this data, and the data that's going to be here, is going to be structured. It's going to have a specific data properties and characteristics associated with them, and tagged associated with them, so that they can be inputted into or transferred into relational tables, and these data can be manipulated and analyzed. So the information in the title page consists of the sponsor confidentiality statement. Yeah, before I go, I just want to quickly just touch on the ICH M11 specification, actually, before I do anything, because this um this technical specification describes what I'm trying to get across. So Um, these are the descriptions of the elements of the table. Yeah, table elements. So basically the data type. Yeah. So these are going to be their variables. So each item that is inserted into the title section are variables, and they can be of various types. They can be a data type, and the data type will be specified, and they can have a this characteristic, which is they can be a heading, they can be a value, or they can be a data. And this is important, the conformance, whether or not something has to be included, whether it's optional or not, I think. And cardinality is the restraints. I'm not sure whether I'm saying this correctly, but in any case, this is a bit more technical, and it talks about the specifications that are applied to the structured data, to the ICH M11, in order to to make it compliant, and in order to make it such that we can manipulate it, because it has to have certain characteristics. And this is part of the digitalization of pharmaceuticals moving forward. So let's go back to ICH M11. So this is the information. So you have your sponsor confidentiality statement, if you want to have one. You have your full title. Now your full title, this is important because it needs to be descriptive enough to identify the scientific aspects of the trial sufficiently to ensure that it is immediately evident what the trial is investigating and on whom, and will allow for retrieval for literature or internet searches. So there's a full title. There's also a short title, which has to be in layman's terms. But anyway, we'll get to there. You have your trial acronym. You have your sponsor protocol identifier. So the title section is really about giving information on the protocol itself, and on the actual how the protocol relates to the clinical trial. Yeah, so the protocol identifier, the protocol, the original protocol, if there is one, the version number, the version date, quite obvious, and then amendment identifier, if you have a way of identifying the number of amendments, the amendment number, amendment scope, what's the scope, the country, etc. And then you have things like the sponsor investigational product codes. So for mine, it would be LAT 101 or LAT 202. The investigational product name, so these will be either non-proprietary names or proprietary names. If you haven't got any, then you admit this because it's not yet been assigned. Yeah. And then you have your trial phase. So these are really important information that can be collated and manipulated, and collated into relational tables and manipulated. And this is the short title that I was referring to, where you have the information in plain language, yeah? So that it can be suitable for use in informed consent forms and ethics committee. You have your sponsor's name and address. You also have information on the co-sponsor. It has to be the legal address in both instances. And also in some countries, you might have a local sponsor name and address. And again, it has to be the legal address. When you're using device manufacturer, medical devices, you have to have the device manufacturer name and the legal address. Then you have your trial identifier, so your regulatory and clinical trial identifier numbers. So, for example, your UDRA-CT or your WHO number. And then your sponsor approval. Then you have your signatories and your medical expert contact details, yeah, or where to get that information from. And then next you have the amendment details. I can't recall if the amendment, I think it is because this is still the same. This is the title part. So it would still be. So you have information on your amendment. When you're amending, you want to look at how that impacts on the enrollment numbers, the actual numbers or percentage enrolled at the time of sponsor approval. because you want to look to see whether or not that has the amendment impacts on your enrollment, because and the number of your enrollment impacts on your statistical analysis, yeah. And then you give your reasons for the amendment. So your primary reason for your amendment, that's one, and you might have a secondary reason, but remember, this is your reason for amendment, not nothing to do with your primary and secondary objectives and estimands, although it might be impacted. And then a summary, and then this is important: is the amendment likely to have a substantial impact on the safety and rights of the participants? Yes or no? If yes, briefly explain. And is the amendment likely to have a substantial impact on the reliability and robustness of the data generated in the clinical trial? Yes or no? Explain, because these are very important. And then you give an overview of the changes. And this is how, well, you can give it in tabular presentation, but you don't have to. And it gives you the instructions as to how to do the overview of changes, what to include. For example, if you're making typographical errors, you don't need to include that in this amendment. So you have, say, for example, a description of the change, a rationale for the change, and the sections affected by the change. Yeah, so that's your title part of your protocol, and that part of your protocol is structured as, oh, I don't think I actually showed you. I don't think I, but this is the sorry, this is the technical specification. Just, yeah, this is the technical specification, and it was adopted in November 2025. And the technical specification, so this is just a description, but here it details the title page components. Yeah, so for example, the sponsor confidentiality statement, the data type, it's a text. This is it's got a heading, um, conformance, it's optional. It's optional whether or not the um, you know, the what I want to say. It's optional as to whether or not you want to put that in. Um, and relationship to the table of contents, it's on the title page, um, and so on. And you've got some more information. Text, I've put text there. Yeah, so the sponsor confidentiality statement consists of different types of variables. It consists of the heading, and then it consists, let's just check, I understand that definition, the heading, definition here, this is the variable for the text. Yes, sorry, didn't want to do that. So the text itself, what you're going to put that in, and so that's going to be something that's a text that you enter, so it's a variable data. So they'll give it a a variable. If you do any work on computing, you'll understand that. And then here, um, the full title. So the full title is the part on the title part where you have the full description that can be searched on the website. So you have the data type, which is the heading, and that's H. Yeah. And then if again on you have the definition, on the definition you have the description. It's a text, but you are going to put that information in. So it's given this number. Oh, sorry. It's given this number. So that's it's just the way that the technical specifications, I think this is for a different subject area, and it's a different way of understanding and looking at this, but it relates to how the data is collected. It's the data is collected as structured, is in a specific structure, and giving it that number, sorry, I just quickly went through it. This number means that the computer can recall the number, the information that you put, your sponsor confidentiality statement, can be recalled with that number. Yeah. So if you do anything on computing and programming, you'll understand that. So I think, did I cover everything with regards to the title? I think I did. Yeah. So that's the title that I've covered, the title component or the title part of the M11. Um, I'm just going to give a very, very quick run through of the actual protocol contents, the table of contents and the actual protocol and what information is in where. Um, So this is quite intuitive, this whole protocol. You have your protocol summary. You have to have a synopsis because that's what the public will see. Your primary and secondary objectives and estimands are important. Your estimands will give you an information with regards to, what you expect to see given the interferences or other unforeseen events. Your overall design of your trial schema, these are important. I think the trial schema is a structured data and your schedule of activities. And then your introduction section, that's section 2. So this is the purpose of the trial. You're looking at your risks and your benefits and your overall risk benefit assessment. Trial objectives, that's looking at the primary objectives and estimands and your secondary objectives and estimands. Your trial design, so this is like, if it's randomized, blinding, etc., etc. Your trial population, what your inclusion exclusion criteria is, contraception for women, and lifestyle restrictions. The actual trial intervention, that's the therapeutic strategy, a description of the investigational trial intervention, the rationale, etc. So your trial intervention is number 6. Number 7 is what to do in case of discontinuation of the trial or withdrawal, patient or participant withdrawal. Trial number 8 is your trial assessment and your procedures. So what are the diagnostics? What are the testing that's going to occur? The pharmacokinetic, what are the biomarkers? And number 9 relates to your adverse events, your serious adverse events, product complaints, etc. Pregnancy and postpartum information, special safety requirements. Number 10 is your statistical considerations. Number 11 is your trial oversight and other general considerations. And 12 is your appendix and supporting details. So, as I said, protocol summary, your synopsis, your overall design. You don't have to use a table, I don't think. Do you? I can't recall whether you have to use a table. Maybe you do. Because a lot of this data, your trial design data will be included as structured data. So I don't know. So the rest of the protocol, some of that information is going to be structured and some of it isn't. Um, so this is your overall trial design, intervention, population, diagnosis or condition, because you could have more than one. It could be treatment agnostic, population age, some information on your control. Yeah. Number of arms, trial blind schema, um, blinded roles, number of participants. I think it's quite intuitive. The trial schema, um, schedule of activities, the purpose of the trial, the assessment of risks and benefits, trial objectives and estimands. Yeah, we've talked about that. I think that these are going to be structured data. Secondary objectives and associated estimands, trial design, trial stopping rules. These are important to have in place before we initiate the studies. What to do after the end of the trial. This is a legal requirement to ensure that patients have continued access to medicines. The trial population, any eligibility criteria. The intervention itself, what the treatment strategy is, what it consists of. Let's just Oh, and the various different arms. Continuation, discontinuation, withdrawal. I'm just going to, this is just a top level review. Assessment and procedures. The assessment and procedures, this involves the use of other bodies, I believe. Is it? Oh, no, no, these are the testing. These are testing. Yeah, the testing, sorry. Adverse reactions, reporting requirements, statistical considerations. Your statistical um, strategy has to be decided in advance. Your analysis, again, that has to be decided in advance. Your statistical and analytical methods. Yeah, I don't think I need to do any more. So that's just informed consent is a process. This will be reviewed by the protocol is also reviewed by the ethics committee. And your appendix. Right, so for part 2 assessment, this is what is member state specific. So it follows its own separate time frames with regards to part 2 assessment. So you have your validation as per usual by day 10. And then you have the part 2 assessment that occurs in earnest. So these are the member state specific documentation that has to be submitted for assessment. By day 55, you would expect to complete that assessment because it requires 45 days assessment period. And then, oh dear, I've got 7 days there, but it's actually 5 days for your final decision and assessment report. Remember that you have an additional 55 days for advanced therapy medicinal product part 2 assessment. So what are the documents that are required? So remember, your part 2 assessment are the ethical and organizational aspects for your trial, and they are member state specific. So you would require information on recruitment, informed consent forms and subject information sheets, CV of your investigators, any declaration of interest, site suitability forms, proof of insurance and indemnification, any financial arrangements with regards to, say, for example, what happens at the end of the trial, and any compliance documents that are required in addition to GDPR. Your administrative documents that are required for your overall will be your cover letter, proof of payment, and statement of compliance. And this is the information that is provided on approval. So if you get a positive positive decision relating to your clinical trial, you have certain information that's provided in the EU portal database that's public facing information. So for phase 1 or phase 1 and 2, you have your structured data fields. So your structured data fields are part of the CTIS application that you fill in directly into the CTIS. So it's not uploaded as a document, it's just typed in. And you type in the selected information, it's not a PDF or anything like that. And you should not include company confidential information. But you have a limited amount of phase 1, phase 2 documents. There was a revision to the CTIS transparency rule based upon feedback from the sponsors, and so they have reduced the amount of documents that are available because of confidentiality, because of company confidentiality. And this is based on the feedback, and the reference is given underneath that table there. And then you have your public facing information, trial information, some Part 2 documents. Obviously, no Part 2 documents that contain um, patient or participant specific information, because that's covered by general data protection regulation and a national additional requirement. So no patient data is published as Part 2 documents, but your recruitment material and your patient public facing information is also published. So as I was talking about when I was talking about structured data, um, well, first of all, it can't be redacted, and it mustn't contain any company confidential information, but it can be included in relational tables, and these can be queried using SQL, SQL, I call it, and similar languages. So you can therefore use the data you can combine it with other data, provided it is appropriate to do so. You can analyze it, and you can look for trends, and you can look for trends in terms of what conditions are being treated, what other phases of development. You can look for things. You can use the data in a much more efficient way, not just also in terms of transparency, but making it efficient so that efficient to review, to analyze. And this is the information for the CTIS that has to be inputted at the moment, but I believe in July 2026. I can't remember whenever the ICH M11 is going to be implemented. Once you use the ICH M11 clinical electronic structured harmonized protocol template, this information will be automatically updated. So the trial title, the sponsor name, the phase, the condition being treated, the IMP name, the countries involved, the recruitment statement, status, endpoints, and the trial design basics. So let's go through this clinical trial regulation again. So this is the regulation EU number 536/2014, yeah? And it repeals the directive 2001/20/EC, yeah? So we're clear on that. It has now come into force, and there should be no clinical trials that are all clinical trials that are conducted within the EU should be in line with regulation 536/2014, yeah? So let's just quickly go a quick overview of what I want to talk about relating to this. And there's only a limited amount that I can say in this presentation, because it will take me a long time. So I just really want to talk about go through some of the definitions, yeah? So what is a clinical study? What is a clinical trial? What is meant by low intervention clinical trial and non-interventional studies? Yeah, because this is quite important. So a clinical study is any investigation that involves human beings, yeah? So it says here, any investigation in relation to humans, yeah? So anything that involves human beings is a clinical. The word clinical refers to human clinical studies. Non-clinical and preclinical relates to animal studies. And the objective of a clinical trial is to determine the safety and the efficacy of the intervention, yeah, or the medicinal products in this particular case. And how do we do that? We need to verify or discover the clinical, pharmacological, or pharmacodynamic effect Yeah, so this is one of the primary investigations, purposes of the investigation, to identify any adverse reactions to the medicinal product, um, or if it's one or more medicinal products, and to look at the pharmacokinetics, so to study the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of one or more medicinal products. Okay, and the whole purpose of those three things is to ascertain the safety and efficacy of of those medicinal products. Now, clinical trial, that's a subset of a clinical study. So it is a clinical study, but it fulfills any one of these three conditions. And it can be the assignment of the subject to a particular therapeutic strategy. So that therapeutic strategy could be the in the um, medicinal product, investigational medicinal product. Now, it may not, in the case of, say, for example, CAR T cell therapies, it's not just giving the patient or the subject the investigational medicinal product. It involves a number of things. So it will involve um, leukapheresis, it will involve treating the patients to suppress their immune system. So it involves and as well and then manufacturing the medicinal product and giving the medicinal product, investigational medicinal product, to the patient. So that's the therapeutic strategy, and whatever that therapeutic strategy is, to the decision to assign that particular therapeutic strategy is decided in advance, and it's not normal clinical practice in that member state. Yeah. The other one of the other conditions that could be met is that the decision to prescribe the investigational medicinal product is taken together with the decision to include the subject in the clinical trial, and then usually for the first two, but this is not exclusively, diagnostic and monitoring procedures in addition to normal clinical practices are applied to the subject. So that means that there will be additional testing of blood samples, testing of urine samples, additional monitoring, follow-up measures, and sort of follow-up steps that will be applied to the subjects in the clinical trial. Now, in the clinical trial directive, it talks about the subject, the patients as subjects, but when we're dealing with them in terms of the informed consent and in terms of the clinical protocol, we talk about them as participants. Yeah, so there's a difference in language when we're talking about the legislation compared to when we're talking about the participants in the clinical trial itself and within those documentations, because the participants at that stage, they have given their informed consent and they're now participating in the clinical trial voluntarily. Low intervention clinical trial means that it has to fulfill all of these conditions. So remember that clinical trial, it can fulfill any one of those three conditions, A, B, and C. But for low intervention clinical trials, um, it has to fulfill all of these conditions. So the investigational medicinal products and has to be authorized, and this excludes placebos, because obviously you wouldn't authorize a placebo because it has no therapeutic effect. Um, or or sorry, the next thing is, according to the protocol, the investigational medicinal product is used in accordance with the terms of the marketing authorization. So in accordance with the SMPC, yeah? Or it's used, the use of this investigational medicinal product is evidence-based and it's supported by published scientific evidence on safety and efficacy. Yeah, on those particular investigational medicinal products in any of the member state concerned. Yeah. So that those are those. This is in accordance to the protocol. And the third criteria, which must be fulfilled, is that any diagnostics or monitoring procedures. So, we talked about it in clinical trials that it's going to be additional to what's normal clinical practice. What they're stating is that it shouldn't be more than the minimum risk and burden to the safety, risk or burden to the safety of the subjects compared to normal clinical practice in member states concerned. So it shouldn't be it shouldn't pose more than the minimal additional risk, yeah, or burden to the safety of the subjects compared to normal clinical practice. And then we have non-interventional studies, which are any studies that are not a clinical trial, yeah. So, investigational medicinal products is something that is used within a clinical trial. It's used in a clinical trial, and it means the medicinal product that is actually being used, tested, or used, and it can be a reference. So, for example, you can be comparing a generic to a reference medicinal product. It can be a placebo, if it's ethical to do so, or it can be another medicinal product, well, a reference medicinal product, and the actual investigational medicinal product that might be under development, yeah. And normal clinical practice, this means the treatment regimen that is typically followed. Um, so what normally happens in those member states when for a particular treatment strategy for a particular disease or diagnosis, what normally happens. Auxiliary medicinal products, this is medicinal products that are required for the needs of the clinical trial. And I think that's it. Informed consent was something that I wanted to talk about. So informed consent is a process, yeah, and it is something that should, oh, here it is. It means the subject's free and voluntary expression of their willingness to participate in a particular clinical trial. Yeah, and after having been informed of all aspects of the trial, so they will review the recruitment and enrollment materials, and yeah, it's subject to their decision to participate. In the case of minors or incapacitated subjects, you have to get a legally designated representative to include them in the clinical trial. So, in order to conduct a clinical trial, you have to be authorized. You have to have that authorization. So that was one of the three things that I'd highlighted. You need to be authorized to conduct a clinical trial, and that authorization requires clinical trial authorization, scientific evaluation and authorization, and ethical authorization. You have to be authorized from a genetically modified organism perspective if it's an ATMP and it's applicable, or it has to be you have to go through your site activation, and your site investigation reports have to be fully approved. So there are certain things that have to be in place before you can conduct a clinical trial. And this is what Article 4 relates to. It relates to the scientific and the ethical review part. That this requires prior authorization. So Article 4 is a clinical trial shall be subject to scientific and ethical review and shall be authorized in accordance with this regulation. So, Article 5 is really about the submission process and the validation process, in my opinion, anyway, from what I've been able to see. So basically, you have to submit it via the EU portal, and that's using the clinical trial information system as a means of making your submission. Yeah. You have to, when applying for low intervention clinical trials, where the investigational medicinal product is not used in accordance with the marketing authorization, but is used in is evidence based and supported by published scientific evidence, you need to state that. Yeah, so you need to state that, propose one member state, yes, when you're doing your submission. So here it is here, which is about the validation and what the validation involves. And the validation involves um, two aspects. The first aspect is stating whether the clinical trial that is applied for falls within the scope of this regulation. That's important. And the second part of the validation is what we normally think of when we think of validation, and that's whether the application dossier is complete. Yeah. And if this is all done within the 10 days, then you will get you'll get that confirmation through the EU portal. If you don't get that confirmation, it's considered to be tacit, i.e. it's considered that it is validated and there's no issue. So Article 5 is about the submission of the application. Article 6 of the clinical trial regulation talks about the assessment report and part one of the assessment report. So there are certain things that it has to, or we're looking at, and this is the therapeutic and public health benefits, the benefit and the risk profile, the compliance with the manufacturing and import of the investigational medicinal products or auxiliary medicinal products. So this will be the GMP requirements, the labeling requirements, the completeness and adequateness of the investigator's brochure, which is what's used by the principal investigator or the chief investigator. And then the assessment report will be looking at certain things, yeah, basically come to a conclusion. And the conclusion is one of the following of um, these three conclusions, and it could be either the conduct of the clinical trial is acceptable in view of the requirements set out in the regulation. That's one conclusion. Or it could be that the conduct of the clinical trial is acceptable in view of the requirements set out by the regulation, but subject to specific conditions. Yeah, and they will be specifically listed in the conclusion. Or the third option is that the conduct of the clinical trial is not acceptable in view of the requirements set out by the regulation. So that's the conclusion as a result of part one. Now, part one, the time frames for part one is as follows. So we've talked about the 10-day validation period, but the final part one assessment report, including its conclusion to the sponsors and other, shall be done within 45 days of the validation date. So remember, you have up to 10 days for your validation, and then you have 45 days from that validation date, whatever that date may be. And how it's divided up, it's divided into 3 phases, yeah? And the first phase is the initial um, draft, if you like, assessment report, and that takes 26 days from the validation date. And then you've got this 12 plus 7 days. So the 12 days is the coordinated review. Um, and this is from the end of the initial assessment phase. So this pattern where you have 12 days plus 7 days is part of, the way that the clinical trial directive guides all of the member states to be involved with all of the assessments for all of the member states concerned document, because we want it to be a harmonized process. So this coordinated review phase is done within 12 days. And this involves all the member states, and then you've got another 7 days for consolidation review, and that's part of Most of the procedures that I think I've read, I think it's for all of them, including substantial modification, and what's the other one? Addition of a new member state if you've got any additional data. But so it's 26 days plus 12 days plus 7, which makes a total of 45 days maximum. Yeah, and then you have your 5 days, your 5 days to get your to give your final decision. Um, So yeah, this is just talking about the draft assessment report. Oh yeah, and the other thing is, so you have an automatic 50 days. Sorry, let's just highlight this. 50 days for clinical trials involving investigational medicinal products. All medicinal products are defined in point 1 of Annex of the regulation. So certain other additional medicinal products, which I haven't actually looked at yet. But certainly for advanced therapy medicinal products, it's a further 50 days. I think I said somewhere 55. It's 50 days for advanced therapy medicinal products. And the other thing is, if you have any request for further information, you have a maximum of 31 days. And that includes both the for the whole process of receiving additional information. So the request for further information, the sponsor has 12 days. So here the sponsor have 12 days, and the review takes 12, I think 12 days, 12, 19 days in total, and it's a coordinated review. And that takes a maximum of 12 days. And then you have 7 days. I think that's for your consolidation. Yeah, 7 days for your consolidation at the end of the coordinate. So you see that pattern, that 12 and 7, and it's carried out, and it involves the coordinated review involves all of the member states, and the consolidation at the end of the coordinated review, and that's to make sure that it's harmonized and to make sure that everybody is harmonized on board, and we're all doing the same thing to the extent that each of the legal member states can do it. Yeah, so that's Article 6, which relates to the Part 1 documents. So let's look at Article 7, aspects covered by Part 2. Yeah, so this is basically telling you um, what the each member state concerned assesses for their own specific country, their specific territory. So here it is, a list A to H, yeah, and basically a compliance with the requirements for informed consent, yeah, compliance with arrangements for rewarding or compensating subjects, and this is a legal requirement. The compliance with regards to arrangements for recruitment, again, that's a legal requirement. This requirement, Directive 95/46 EC, I think that's the data protection, but that has been that is no longer in effect, and it's the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and there may be additional local requirements as well. I think that is, I'll double check that afterwards. And then number 49, if you look further down, this is about in Article 49, it's about the suitability of the investigator, and that it has to be the investigator in charge of the clinical trial has to be a medical doctor, basically. And 50, again, if you look down further down this regulation in Article 50, this is about site suitability, and that's one of the documentations that's given. And this Article 76, again, if you look further down, we're not going to check it, but it relates to the damage compensation. And then here, compliance with applicable rules for collection, storage, future use of biological samples of the subject. So this is the information on the subjects themselves and the protections for the subject. And then it talks about the actual procedural timelines, sorry, the procedural timelines. So it's 45 days from the validation date. And it has to be submitted through the EU portal and submitted at usually for the initial application, it's submitted at the same time. You're not going to do it. Well, I mean, you can stagger it. You can stagger it. Yeah, you can. Um, but it's usually done at the same time. At least I would think it would be. Um, so again, you request further information, that's 31 days. So that's the standard 31 days. And if you do request 31 days, the standard is 12 days from receipt. The sponsor has 12 days to provide the information. This is the standard. And then upon receipt of the information, there's an additional 19 days. Yeah. And that's the 19 days. And then this is your final decision. And I'll do that separately. Right. And this is the last part of the initial application where you have your decision. So each member state will notify via the EU portal within 5 days from the reporting date. Yeah. Of their decision, yeah, and it's a single decision from each member state within 5 days of the reporting date or from the last date of the assessment report, whichever one is later. Yeah, so that's where we get that 5-day window. This is if you're going to get either approval or approval with conditions, specific obligations and conditions, or not approval. But if, say, for example, you have a member state that doesn't agree and doesn't want to agree to the uh, clinical trial in its territory. Yeah, these are the grounds. There's only 3 conditions. The first one is if it considers that the clinical trial, the subject will be receiving inferior treatment than what's already available in that member state for normal clinical practice. Second is if there's an infringement on their national law. And thirdly, if it relates to the safety and the subject safety and data reliability and robustness. So this is either during the initial assessment of Part 1 documents or following on from responses to further information or request for further information. So if the member state concerns disagrees with the conclusion, it has to communicate it, but it can only be based upon these 3 grounds. Right, so for part 2 assessment, this is what is member state specific. So it follows its own separate time frames with regards to part 2 assessment. So you have your validation as per usual by day 10. And then you have the part 2 assessment that occurs in earnest. So these are the member state specific documentation that has to be submitted for assessment. By day 55, you would expect to complete that assessment because it requires 45 days assessment period. And then, oh dear, I've got 7 days there, but it's actually 5 days for your final decision and assessment report. Remember that you have an additional 55 days for advanced therapy medicinal product part 2 assessment. So, Article 14 relates to the addition of a subsequent member state, and it takes up to 52 days, notwithstanding any request for further information. So if you want to extend your clinical trial to another member state that wasn't in the original initial application, you can do so using this mechanism. And that might be if you want to include increase your numbers in terms of your recruitment. So what is the time frame? So the additional member state has to accept the Part 1 documents, and the only conditions or the only grounds that it can refuse are the same as what was pointed out previously, and that is that the clinical trial would lead to a subject receiving an inferior treatment that's in the normal clinical practice in that member state. There's an infringement with regards to the national law of that member state, or there are issues with regards to subject safety and reliability and robustness of the data. So those are the three conditions that they can refuse. Now, when the additional member state is reviewing, they're reviewing the Part 1 assessment documents, and they're also reviewing their documents, their Part 2 documents. So they have two sets of periods, if you like, where they can request for further information. So the part that they can request via the reporting member state part, if they have additional, they require additional information for Part 1 documents. Yeah. So if they do, yeah, if it relates to Part 1 documents, and this is number 6 of Article 14, here it is here. They've got a maximum of 31 days that they can that's set aside for this. Yeah. So this only relates to Part 1. Where did I see it? Part 1 documents, Part 1 of the assessment report. Yeah. And again, this harmonized approach is the sponsor has 12 days to respond, and then when they've received the additional response, remember, this is for Part 1 assessment report, there's a coordinated review, and that takes a maximum of 12 days from receipt of the additional information. Remember, this is on the Part 1. And then there's another 7 days for consolidation at the end of the coordinated review. And then the reporting member state shall take due account of considerations and shall record how all considerations have been dealt with. So that's the Part 1 section of the dossier. And also, the additional member state can also assess its own information within those time frames, and they have 31 days for that. Yeah. So they can, so for on the Part 2 section of their assessment report, yeah, they have the ability, or the requirements, or enable to request further information, and that takes a maximum of 31 days. And in this particular case, yeah, it's the sponsor again has 12 days to respond, and then upon receipt, they have a maximum of 19 days to make their assessment on the additional information. Yeah. So that is the addition of a subsequent member state concerned. So the substantial modification can be to Part 2 of the assessment report, or it could be to Part 1 or Part 2. And the concerned articles are Articles 15 to 24. So chapters 3, which includes Article 15 to Article 24, as I've shown in the clinical trial regulation itself, relates to substantial modification. So a substantial modification is any change that impacts on or likely to have a substantial impact on number one, the safety and rights of the participants, or on the reliability and robustness of the data. Any change that has an impact on those two aspects is a significant change, or a change that needs to be investigated, or at least approved, is a substantial modification. So it can include things like addition of a new clinical trial site, or change of the principal investigator, at a particular clinical trial site. So these changes can only be implemented if it's been approved in accordance with the the procedures that are set out in that particular chapter 3. And this is just an overview of the time frames required for substantial modification. So your substantial modification can include quality changes, it can include safety changes, and it can include efficacy changes, but they're substantial and they have to be evaluated and approved, and it can be the scientific approval as well as the ethical approval. So 6 days from your submission you have your validation, and then you've got 38 days following validation for the assessment. You have an additional 31 days if the data is not sufficient, and there's additional information is required. So there's a request for further information that involves 12 days for the sponsor and 19 days for the reporting member state, the member state concerns. And that 19 days involves the 12 and the 7. So that's 12 days for the coordinated review and 7 days for consolidation. Again, for ATMPs, you have in this particular specific situation the option, or an optional 50 days to add it on for for that assessment. So that's the overview of the time frame. It is it's there to ensure that any changes that before they can be implemented, we take into consideration the rights and dignity and safety of the participants of the trial, and we also have to assess and ensure that the reliability and robustness of the data generated is maintained. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please don't hesitate to leave a like. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.